I will record these, and then after class, either later that night or early in the morning, I'll have them posted. So if you can't make a class, remember, it's not a mandatory that you attend on Wednesday evenings, but certainly is helpful because you can get some questions answered. But if you have things going on, you can always go in there and pull up the recording. So just remember that if something comes up. So really, before I get into some of the content or some of the readings or materials in the PowerPoint, I just want to start off and open it up and see if anyone has specific questions related to the interview assignment. I received several emails as your groups start working on them, just asking for clarification. So I've tried to get back to those group members to make sure they understand. But while we're on here, if anyone has any questions you want to ask me regarding that interview assignment, I'll be glad to answer those and clarify questions for you. I will tell you this. I went back and looked, and I thought that I had one posted. I do not. I do have examples of the assessment reports for like informal, normed reference, and the CBM, but I can go back in and put an example under the SPED 805 resources for the interview group paper, so you can kind of see how it was laid out, and so you'll kind of know how to format that. So I'll go ahead and give you guys opportunity to ask questions on the interview project paper, and we'll spend a little time on that. Looks like Alice, I think, has her hand raised.
Yes.
Hands. So Alice, go ahead. I'll start with you.
Okay. Okay, now I'm drawing a blank. I had two questions.
Okay.
Oh yeah, the contract. Do we have to use the template that was given in the past? What we did was we just assigned roles and emailed our teacher.
That's fine. You just send me a copy showing who's committed to doing what. That's
okay.
Fine. I'm flexible with that document. That's good.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then the second question was, I read somewhere that we need to submit like the interview itself. I made a recording. Do you need the recording of the interview?
Just send me the audio file.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm good with that.
All right.
So I'll accept an audio file if you recorded it versus going in there and transcribing. Yep. So
okay, thank you. That was it.
Welcome. Any other questions? This is the one assignment. Seems like there's always some confusion on it at first on exactly what we're supposed to compile or how do we go about doing it. So just want to make sure everyone feels good about it before we move on into something else. Looks like Angela's got her hand up.
A question about the APA 7 on the references. Do we just list it at the bottom, or do we need to quote them every time that we're quoting them?
Just list it at the bottom, because this is kind of a different type of project because you are actually interviewing and getting a lot of direct quotes. So just list that at the bottom. Okay. Right. On this. Now, on the other assignments, you would do it as normal. Okay. But on this one, a little bit different situation. Yes, thank you. Looks like I have. I'm sorry. Go ahead. I'm pulling one out in the chat box, but go ahead.
Oh, sorry. So I only have one other person in my group, and you wanted 4, right?
Well, I put a limit of 4 on there, not to exceed 4, basically. So if there's 2 of you, that's fine. Just we put a limit of 4 people on there, so we wouldn't have everyone sign up for just 1 or 2 groups.
Okay.
Okay. One of the questions in the chat box, and this has been a very common question that's been sent to me by email. Do we submit the interviews as a whole group or individually? So you will submit the interview report as one. Okay. Remember, when you registered or self-enrolled in those scenario groups, it will tie every group member to that submission, and it will show that I have an assignment to grade for each one of you in the grade book. And so when I go in there and score it and assign the points that you earned, it's going to give you each group member those points. So it's linked all your group members together. Does that answer your question? I think it was Terry Anderson. Okay. So you will submit one interview paper, the report. Okay, it's going to be lengthy. Then As an individual, you're going to submit a peer assessment rubric where you're going to go in and rate the peers that were in your group that work with you. Okay. And make sure you list yourself on that. Do a self-evaluation. Okay. So include yourself on that. So if there's 3 members in that group, you each will submit a peer assessment rubric. Okay. Any questions on that? Because you'll get individual points for that. Okay. Looks like Nicholas, I saw your hand was up, sir. So go ahead.
Yeah, yeah, I was out of town last week, so I missed the first Zoom. I went to join the group thing, just put myself in a group. When I checked, nobody was in any group, so I thought I kind of beat it to the punch. I went today to like send out the email to everyone to like make a group chat. There's no one in my group. I'm not going to like make or request anybody join in my group. I don't know. If I have to do it on my own, I can. But do I need to be the group or what?
At this point, because a lot of the groups have already proceeded forward, because I'd sent an email encouraging everyone to do that, I would just proceed individually, and I've had some that's had to do that before. So
It's no problem.
Okay.
I just wondered. It's okay.
no, you'll be good. Thank you. Any other questions? No? Okay, and I'll read your reports, but just real quick, take a few minutes. When you guys did your interview projects, and I mentioned this last week, did you notice any, as you started communicating with your group members, any really distinct differences amongst when you compare the people you interviewed? For example, Robin, if you interviewed one and then Cal was in your group, I'm just throwing that out there. But if you guys were in a group together, did you see any big, vast differences between the 2 individuals? Everyone just kind of has a deer in the headlight
Yeah.
look this evening. I think everybody's worn out. It's Wednesday.
I haven't seen a vast difference, although maybe some varying on what kind of assessment or not what kind, but the choice of assessment
Okay.
names basically is
That
one
they
that's
use,
I
yeah.
noticed.
That may be one of the big differences your groups will see is just certain districts' preferences on what assessments they choose to use, and will use that consistently. So a lot of times it just kind of depends on suspected disabilities going in and what assessment you'll use for that. Certain ones they feel like might be more reliable and valid, which it talks a little bit about that on some of the PowerPoints for the first 2 weeks. So probably I would say the biggest difference you may run into in any given group is just maybe the significant difference in years of experience. That's where I really notice it every year or every semester. Sometimes we'll have group members together and one interviewee may only have 5 years experience and another one in that group may have 25. So it's always interesting to get their take and their perspective on that. So any other questions, comments, concerns about that assignment that's coming up due? No? Okay. Well, if not, I'll move in, start doing a screen share and talk a little bit about some of the highlights of the PowerPoints that are on there. And then kind of start as we wrap up, we'll kind of start talking just briefly about the informal assessment assignment and what all that will entail. So if you give me just a few minutes here, I'm going to share my screen, flip over. So can everyone see my screen? Should show a PowerPoint that says Chapter 4, Reliability and Validity. Does everyone see that? Okay. So I'm going to hit a few points here we talk about, and I just mentioned this when different districts are looking for specific assessments as they feel comfortable using, especially assessments that are used to determine eligibility for services. This is where it becomes very important. And so some of the main things that we look at, especially from the school psychologist or school psychometry side, is making sure we have assessments or testing instruments that are very reliable and are valid. And so basically, a lot of times people interchange or use reliability and validity together, when in actuality there's a difference between the two, and it gives a very simple definition and breakdown here. You can see it talks about reliability is the dependability and consistency of an instrument across time or items. And so being able to get consistent results, and it also being dependable on assessing the different areas that you're wanting to measure. So that is very important. Finding a testing instrument that's reliable, and then one also that's valid, and looking to make sure of the validity. And so that's basically an instrument or an assessment that will measure or assess what it was designed to do. So that's basically the difference between the two when we look at reliability and validity. Something that it also talks about, I won't go into a lot of some of these other terms other than just mentioning those, because really when you get into correlation and the different types of correlation, that's if you were going to kind of pursue going into a role to where you're going to be an examiner and going in and scoring these assessments and reporting and coming in and explaining those. But one thing they're looking at is a correlation, the basically the degree, the relationship between a couple of different variables. So those variables could be two different administrators given the same test, or an administration of equivalent forms, testing forms. And so we have multiple different forms we use when we go in and assess students on the more formalized tests, not informal or anything like that. So again, this is when you get into norm reference and having to have qualified examiners. When we look at methods of measuring reliability, whether it's an informal assessment, whether it's a normed reference, or even criterion reference, or I'm sorry, curriculum-based measurement, we want to look at measuring reliability. And there are different ways to do that. One is test and retest. So we give the test, wait a short period, then turn around and retest to see if it's reliable, if we get similar results. Also, I mentioned using equivalent forms, doing a split half, where we go in with two different forms and we split it and use half and half and then compare. And then also the Cooter-Richardson formulas, which we won't even get into during this course. We talk about equivalent forms of reliability. And so this is if you're going to be measuring a specific skill and you're going to use multiple different forms. And so you're wanting to make sure that the forms are equivalent and each one of them is going to be reliable, so your results will be consistent. So an advantage would be two tests of the same difficulty level that can be administered in with a short time frame, and that will influence the different outcomes on that. So something to definitely keep in mind. Also, consistency measurements. We mentioned the split half reliability, the Cooter-Richardson, and the coefficient alpha. Those are just different internal means of making sure that measurements are consistent. Again, we really won't get into a lot of that in this specific course, but I just kind of wanted to mention that so you're aware of it. We also talk about, and this is more normed reference, and it would be informal or CBM, but a standard error of measurement. So basic assumption that the assessment has some small error that might exist within. There are also variables, and this goes back to the testing environment. Is it a poor testing environment? Are there variables when we think about the student? Are they coming to school tired consistently? Are they hungry? So when you're suspecting a student that you're working with that may have some type of disabilities, those are also some factors that have to be taken into consideration. looking at student variables. Hungry, tired, what kind of shape are they coming to school in consistently every day that could affect the learning process? Are there any errors in the type of assessments that you're using? Any type of informal assessment? Are there any errors that may be in that type of assessment that you select? So you want to definitely make sure that you are going to use some type of assessment instrument that has a small standard of error. Okay, very little room for error on that. Okay, remember this, and you'll hear me say this throughout the course. A single test may not accurately reflect a student's true score. Okay, remember that. And you're going to hear me say this. Don't rely on one specific assessment to determine whether a student's going to qualify or not. Again, we're going to talk about looking at the whole picture and taking into account a lot of different variables when it comes down to time to make those decisions for placement. So here's a basic formula for calculating standard errors of measurement. Again, you're not going to have to do that in this course. That's a little bit more advanced, but later on down the road, if you chose to pursue this is something that they would teach you, and you'd have to go in and calculate by hand. So it's always kind of interesting and good to understand how they come up with the standard error of measurement, and taking into account that along with the standard deviation and the reliability factors. But again, a little bit more advanced for this type of course, but at least kind of wanted to show that to you so you are aware of how that process works. Okay, here's another thing to think about. And again, with doing informal CBM and your norm reference, you might get into or see a little bit on that norm reference support, depending on what assessment you were to select, but estimating true scores. And so a true score is always assumed to be nearer the mean than the actual obtained score. So there's a little bit of a factor that we utilize to come up with estimated true scores, and that's involved by using the mean, reliability coefficient, and then actually their obtained or raw score. And we run it through a formula and calculate that. Again, not going to really be expected to do that for this class. I'm going to stop sharing and switch over quickly to another PowerPoint. Quickly, I wanted to point out looking a little bit more on the legal side, ethics and issues. Can everyone see? It should say chapter 2, laws, ethics and issues. Okay, so a little bit quickly, and in your SPED law class, you will go into this a lot more detail, but it's kind of want to give you a broad overview. So different influences on litigation and legislation when it comes to special education. So you have parents, professionals, and then also the litigation in court systems. So you have different SPED acts, Public Law 94-142, and so that has been updated through time. It all started most commonly known back in 1975, and so as time has went on, there had been changes and updates to that. And so basically, after each of the reauthorizations, regulations, which are legal guidelines, may have somewhat changed a little bit, especially in being in compliance with the law. So 1975 really is when all that changed. And then here you can kind of see this particular slide kind of shows the evolution on how it's changed from the original Public Law 94-142 up to IDEA 2004. And so you can see there were changes in 1975, 1986, 97, and 2004. 2004, I don't know how many of you guys were in education at that time. Some of you maybe were toddlers at that time. I don't know. So in 04, a lot of that came about after No Child Left Behind. was enacted, which was a major testing piece of legislation that was enacted back during the Bush administration. And so it was really driving a lot of testing at that time. And you may hear or have heard a lot about No Child Left Behind. So that was one of the last times that IDA had a significant change or revision made to it. So this is a good slide to reference, going back and looking at how it evolved over time. So one thing I wanted to point out here, and I briefly mentioned this, just throwing some things out in our meeting last week. How do we go about the testing process? Do we just pull a kid in and test them? And so a lot of it, when you start the formal process, begins with parental consent. Most of you guys are experiencing that in your role now. Some of you maybe haven't gotten that far into it, but no testing or reevaluation can take place without the informed consent of the parent. Okay, so always remember that. It's very important when we're looking at doing an initial or also doing the reevaluation process. Parent needs to be fully informed of all the educational activities. For instance, why does the student need to be evaluated? What procedures are going to be used? Also, that informed consent, if they speak a language other than English, depending on where you're at, you may have some non-English speaking parents, making sure that you provide that consent in their language, or if they require hearing or visual impairments. So making sure that you meet the needs of the parents there. That's all falls under IDEA. So keep that in mind. Also, some procedural safeguards, making sure to outline the parents and students' rights with regard to special education process, information regarding the initial evaluation, making sure that you've given proper notice and meet the timelines on that, information on the parent consent, how to obtain student records, process to follow when you have parental complaints, and also making sure you understand the methods to resolve those complaints. So that's all kind of built in for procedural safeguards. Start talking a little bit about non-discriminatory assessment. And so it's all mandated by IDEA that non-discriminatory evaluation be conducted on children when they're referred for special education or related services. Basically, we want to make sure that the whole process is fair and objective and it's equitable, okay? Meeting the student, the student and parent needs, kind of going back to, especially if they're non-English speaking or require other special services. Also making sure additional measures or strategies other than tests are considered. Again, I made the comment a while ago that not to rely on just one assessment solely to make your decision on whether the child should be placed or not. Also, information should be gathered through a process focusing on student participation in the gen ed curriculum. That kind of goes along with going back to the first assessment, the informal. That's learning how to use some short, quick snapshot assessments to start gathering data and information due to maybe some suspicions you have that the child is deficient in some areas. So you're going to learn this semester on how to administer some of those various assessments to start gathering data and collecting information to include when you go to the table to determine placement. Okay, evaluation data needs as part of the initial or reeval process. A team may review existing data that may not require formal testing, but just a review of progress. So that's not uncommon. Just because a student's reeval is coming up after the 3 years, the team may decide not to reevaluate them and may base their decision to continue services just based on progress of the student, feedback from gen ed teachers and everyone on the team. But you may not do that without a formal meeting, okay? You still need to go through the meeting process, have parents involved. Make sure you identify what additional data would be needed, if any, and have that available to take place, that available when those discussions take place, okay? And then if you have any additional assessments that you've conducted yourself. Okay, evaluating students with suspected learning disabilities. So basically, prior to 2004, the use of a severe discrepancy model was used to determine learning disabilities. Severe discrepancy between their cognitive ability and their overall achievement, okay? And that was often looked at as the wait and fail model, okay? As a student would struggle for several years before receiving help, okay? You may know of some students in your district that this has happened to, okay? Where maybe they just were shy of meeting some criteria, and here they are, they're going to end up struggling for another year, and you're going to continue to monitor that. So IDA in 2004 included some guidelines that were tweaked a little bit, changed, modified on how learning disabilities could be diagnosed through early intervention, use of research-based practices, response to intervention, and no more relying on severe discrepancy. And so this is more known as a contemporary assessment model, which would benefit those students that were getting caught up here prior to 2004. So you may have some students now that you're serving, as I mentioned, that were falling into that model of wait and fail, versus the second example that we just talked about. Here's one that's common in school districts: ADD, attention deficit disorder. Okay, so under IDEA, ADD is not a specific category, okay, under IDEA rules, but students with ADD who require special education services may typically receive them under one of three categories. Could be under learning disabilities, behavioral disability, or other health impairment. See it probably fall under OHI, other health impairment, more than the other two that are mentioned. So those are the three categories that they oftentimes are categorized under. Oftentimes too, depending on your district and what you've seen, if students perhaps with ADD don't qualify for special education services, don't meet the full criteria, they may qualify under a 504 plan, which the 504 is more medical reasoning, okay? So remember, students with ADD must undergo a comprehensive evaluation by a multidisciplinary team to determine their overall eligibility, okay? So we see a lot of ADD now. Team evaluations, IEP, okay? We know there must be a multidisciplinary evaluation. Team must include or obtain information from a variety of sources, okay? So it could be coming from the parents. You guys know that we have them do the adaptive behavior scales. That's part of the process, right? You're sending those home. Usually you have the parent fill them out, and you also have a gen ed teacher. And that way you're getting additional information regarding students' everyday behaviors or activities, habits, things like that, that the parent and the gen ed teacher has observed. You're getting information from the SPED teacher. Also, you're having representation from a member of the school district, usually it's administrator, someone who's going to interpret those results, the qualified examiner, and other individuals who have knowledge of that child. Could be an outside medical person, so a social worker that maybe is working with the family, or maybe an outside counselor that's been working with them as well, trying to assist the family. Okay, determining eligibility. So in 2004, IDA started using global criteria to determine eligibility for the remaining disability categories. Okay, states typically have more specific criteria in their individual regulations. So what you guys do in Kansas may vary compared to other states that we have graduate students in that are attending. So that's always interesting to kind of hear the differences when we have students from across the country that are in classes with individuals from Kansas, to see some of the differences. Okay, your decisions to place a student should also be based on objective data. Also, parents are to be active participants, receive full copies of those reports. If a student's determined eligible, the team determines what services and or related services that student's going to receive. And children cannot be determined to have a disability because of simply lack of instruction in reading, math, or limited English proficiency. So you can't just base it solely on that. So keep that in mind. Okay, the components, most of you guys have been involved in IEP, so I'll just kind of touch this on this quickly. You guys know the components. Every child who receives special education must have an individual plan. We know that. IEP must have at minimum the following components: grade equivalents, age equivalents, their scores, present levels of performance, CBAs, CBMs, curriculum-based measurements, classroom behavior, also measurable long-term annual goals, how that progress is going to be measured, and also include, will that child take alternate assessments or and description of benchmark and short-term objectives. So remember, those are components that have to be included. Also, considerations for your IEP team are the strengths and needs of the child, concerns of parents regarding their child, the results of assessments, any behavioral considerations, limited English proficiency, blind, visually impaired, communication needs, and assistive technology that child could need to help them be successful. So those are definitely considerations. Due process, has anybody been involved in due process, special education in your district? No, I'm seeing most of you shake your heads no. Okay, just hope and pray that you never have to. Those tend to be very, can get very ugly and are not pleasant to deal with. So I've never personally had to do that, but know colleagues who have through the years, and not pleasant stories to hear. So just make sure, just always focus on trying to do the right thing and the best thing for the students that you're serving, and have an open line of communication with your parents. If you're doing this and keeping the best interests of the child in mind, a lot of times this can be totally avoided and never have to experience this. So just keep that in mind when you're working with special education students and also their parents. Also, during due process, remember this, that during that process that you have to go through, that the student will remain in special education placement with services that he or she is supposed to be receiving. Okay, just because there's a dispute there between the school and the parent and all that, you're still obligated to provide services to that student. Okay, so make sure that if you ever get into that you continue those services for the student and the child. Okay, 504, quickly. We know that this is a civil rights law, and it is designed basically to prevent any type of discrimination against individuals with disabilities. Okay, it also extends beyond the categories. The IDA is oftentimes medically driven to provide a service for the student. So I just wanted to kind of mention that to you. I think my last slide here. Just mainly mentioning that. So have you guys had to deal with a lot of 504 plans in your district? Are you seeing more and more of those, or not so many? No, seeing a lot of heads shaking. Okay. Again, a lot of times this may come up when a particular student you have is struggling. I'm going to stop share real quick. That student is struggling and he or she does not qualify. You've tried the testing process and they're not qualifying. So a lot of times they might be able to qualify due to medical purposes. We mentioned ADD earlier. Sometimes that student may be placed on a 504. They didn't meet the criteria for placement when you went through the evaluation process to see if they would qualify. So oftentimes that's another way to get those students some help. So real quick, I see in the chat box where the PowerPoint's posted. So when you go into your learning modules, learning module 1 was broken down for week 1 and week 2. And so when you go down through there, week 1, if you click on those tabs, you will see it'll drop down and you'll see PowerPoints, and it may say chapter 3 PowerPoint or chapter 4 PowerPoint. And that's where you will find those on there. So just go into your learning modules, and then after this week, we'll go into module 2. If you look on that, it's module 2 will take up most of the course. It's 5 weeks, and it will have it broken down like week 3, week 4, week 5, 6, and 7. And if you'll click on each one of them, when you do, it'll drop down and you'll see the PowerPoints posted there. Okay. Are there any questions about anything I went over, or any other opportunity for questions regarding the group interview assignment? No, see heads shaking. So remember, if you do have questions, if something comes up as you're finalizing that paper, please shoot me an email if you have questions. Again, I always try to make sure I check those before 7 a.m. and then I'll do it again that evening after 5. So if I miss you on the morning side, I'll catch it on the afternoon, evening side. Okay. And then I will post this recording as well. Okay. All right. Hey, look at here. It's 6:40. So I did all that and made up 3 hours and got you out before that 9:30 deadline I mentioned, huh? So that's pretty good, right? Hey, you guys hang in there. I know this is a busy time, spring, so many activities, and also it's getting toward the end of the year, and you start getting tired and worn out. So hang in there. And again, if you need help, let me know. Questions. If something comes up and you see you're going to struggle to meet the deadline, please reach out to me by email, communicate that with me, and we'll work through that. Okay. All right. Thank you guys. Have a great evening. See you next week. Bye-bye.